So we've got a ton of huge wild turkeys. You guys can't, they're just out of camera range, so I can't quite show you. The sad thing is, even with Thanksgiving coming up, that we're in an area that only youth can hunt turkeys. So those from 10 to 17 can hunt in this area for turkeys. But anyone older than 17, 18 and older, can't. Now that wouldn't be too bad, except for my daughter's only 9. So even though I've taught her all that there is about guns and gun safety, how to clean and check and take care of, and not to mess around with guns when adults aren't around, and a whole slew of other things, she's not old enough to go hunting yet. Anyway, those turkeys would be huge turkeys for Thanksgiving. Anyway, so we've got Jim Butcher's White Knight. We are on chapter 40. And if you guys remember right, they are currently in the Wraith Cavern, I guess you'd call it, fighting an onslaught of apparently regenerating ghouls. By they, I mean Marcone and a whole bunch of hired thugs. Murphy, Thomas, Ramirez, Dresden, all the vampire courts, and they, I should say Dresden is trying now to get the Wraith court out and as many thralls as he can, when, like I said, they just noticed that these ghouls are actually regenerating themselves from even being blown up to tiny bits. So let's go ahead here, kind of figure out what's going on, and grab your copy of the book. Let's go ahead, like, share, subscribe to the channel, please, if you would. And let's jump in here to chapter 40. I sprinted toward the little knot of struggling vampires around the White King, while dozens of uber ghouls ripped into the leading families of the White Court. I slipped on some slimy ichor, but didn't fall on my ass. For me, it's actually pretty good. I noted more details on the way, and started trying to think ahead of the next few seconds. Assuming we got to the White King in one piece, and convinced Laura to team up and follow us, then what? What was the next step? At least a dozen ghouls bounded out the tunnel, heading up that slope to the cave's entrance. They'd be in a good position to stop Laura's mortal security forces from pushing through the tunnel to rescue the king. Stopping a charge over open ground with firearms is one thing. Using a gun to charge a large, deadly, powerful predator in close quarters is a different proposition entirely, and not a winning one. Naturally, the ghouls in the tunnel would also be in position to intercept anyone who tried to flee, which meant that we had to leave through the gate, which meant that if Ramirez and Marcone's men lost, we were screwed. And that meant that if Cal was over there and saw what was going on, he would hardly sit by and do nothing. I might be able to counter him if I were defending the gate. My skills aren't fine, but I'm pretty strong, and I'm good at adapting them on the fly. Cowell had cleaned my clock in 2 fights already, but slowing and delaying him wasn't the same as trying to wipe the walls with him. Even if I couldn't be a real threat to him, personally, I could tie him up long enough to hold the gate until we could skedaddle. Ramirez couldn't. He was a dangerous combat wizard, but his skills just weren't strong enough or broad enough to pose a significant obstacle to Cowell, if Cowell or Vito for that matter, saw what was going on, and the ghouls concentrated on the gate. The shrieks and roars of the struggle on the right suddenly got louder, and I saw the resistance around Lord Scavis and his henchmen suddenly buckle. The horrible glee of the ghouls rushing into the opening was almost more terrifying than the carnage that followed. I caught a glimpse of Vito Malvora in the middle of the mess, shoving a ghoul toward a wounded vampire, snarling at others, giving orders. The largest of the ghouls were with Vito. "That vampire has the strongest and largest of those creatures with him," Marcone called to me as we ran. "He'll hit any pockets of resistance with them. Use them as a hammer." "I can see that," I snapped. "Murphy, Marcone, cover our right. Hendricks, Thomas, get ready to go in." "Go in where?" Hendricks asked. I took my staff in hand, focused on the fight raging around the White King, and called up my will and hellfire. "In the hole I'm about to make," I growled. "Get them out." "They're mostly eating now. By the second we start to break them free," Marcone cautioned me from behind, "these others are going to come after us." "I know," I said. "I'll handle it." I felt something warm press up against my lower back. Murphy's shoulders. "We'll make sure that—" Her voice broke off suddenly, and that boxy little submachine gun chattered in 3 quick bursts, punctuated by a single throaty roar of Marcone's shotgun. Holy crap, that was close. "Another!" Marcone warned, and the shotgun blasted again. The air horn in Justine's hand started blaring more desperately. "Harry!" Thomas shouted. "Go!" I shouted at Thomas and Hendricks. Then I leveled the staff on the nearest clump of an enormous ghoul and shouted, "Fulzare!" My will lashed out, leashed to Lashiel's hellfire, and rushed upon the ghouls, exploding in a sphere of raw force that blazed with flickers of sulphurous flame. It blew them up and outward like extras on the set of the A-Team, flying in high arcs. Some of them flew right through the falling curtain of water behind the throne and into the abyss depths below. Others slammed hard into the nearest wall, and still others fell among the frenzied ghouls now finishing off Lord Scavis and his retainers. Thomas and Hendricks charged forward. My brother had slipped his shotgun into his sheath over one shoulder and now wielded his saber in one hand and that inward belt knife in the other. The first ghoul he reached was still staggered from the blast that had sent his companions flying, and Thomas never gave him a chance to recover. The saber removed his arm, and the scathing upward sweeping slash of the crooked knife struck its head from its shoulders. The vicious kick to the small of its back crunched into its spine and sent the maimed, beheaded creature flying into the next in line. Hendricks came in at his side. The big man could not possibly overpower one of the ghouls, despite all the muscle. But he did have an important factor on his side: mass. Hendricks was a huge man, 300 pounds and more, and once I saw him hit the ghouls, I no longer had any doubts about whether he had played football. He hit an unbalanced ghoul in the back, knocking the creature sprawling, slammed the stock of the huge gun into the neck of the ghoul, who turned to follow Thomas's motion, then ducked a shoulder and slammed it into the stunned creature's flank, sending it sprawling. Thomas hacked down another ghoul. Hendricks powered through a single creature who never had the chance to set itself against his locomotive rush, and we were suddenly faced with a line of savage goddesses bathed in black blood. Laura stood in the center, her white robes pressed against her skin, soaked in the dark fluids leaking from the crushed and broken ghouls, and it left absolutely nothing to the imagination. Her hair, too, had been soaked flat to her skull, and it clung to the skin of her black, splattered cheek and to the lines of her dark-stained throat. In each hand she held a long, wavy-bladed knife, long enough to qualify as a small sword, though God only knew where she'd concealed the weapons before. Her eyes were chrome, wide and triumphant, and I jerked my gaze away from them as I felt a mad desire just to stare and see what happened. In that moment, Laura was more than simply a vampire of the White Court, a succubus, pale and deadly. She was a reminder of days gone by when mankind paid homage to blood-soaked goddesses of war and death, revered the dark side of the protective, maternal spirit, the savage core of the strength that still allowed tiny women to lift cars off their children, or turn upon their tormentors with a newfound power. Laura's power at that moment hovered around her, deadly in its primal seduction, its sheer strength. On either side of her stood two of her sisters, all of them tall, all of them beautiful, all of them gorgeous and soaked in gore, all of them armed with those wavy-bladed short swords. I didn't know any of them, but they stared at me with ravenous energy, with maddeningly seductive destruction splattered all over them, and it took me 2 or 3 seconds to remember what the hell was going on. Laura swayed a step toward me, all the motion in her thighs and hips, her eyes brilliant and steady, focused on me, and I felt a sudden urge to kneel that vibrated in my brain and elsewhere. I mean, how bad could that be? Just think of the view from down there, and it had been a long time since a woman and I dimly heard Murphy's gun chatter again, and Marcone's, and I shook my head and kept my feet. Then I scowled at Laura and croaked, "We don't have time for this. Do you want out or not?" "Thomas!" Justine cried. She appeared from behind Laura and Wraith sisters, and threw herself boldly upon my brother. Thomas wrapped an arm around her without releasing his grip on his knife, and pressed her hand against his. I could see his profile as she held him back with his face. Was transported, I suppose. Thomas always had a certain look, whether he was making a joke, working out, or giving me a hard time about something. The sense of him was always the same, self-contained, confident, pleased with himself and unimpressed with the world around him. In Justine's arm, he looked like a man in mourning, but he bent his whole body to her, holding her with every fiber and sinew, not merely his arm, and every line of his face became softer, somehow gentler. And though he had been suddenly relieved of an intolerable agony I had never realized he felt, though I noticed that neither he nor Justine touched each other's skin. "Ah," Laura said. Her voice was quavering. "Silvery thing, utterly fascinating and completely inhuman. True love." "Dresden!" Marcone shouted. Hendricks spun away from where he had been staring at the Wraith sisters with much the same expression I must have had, and stomped past me. I shortly heard him aiding the racket of his big gun to that of Marcone's and Murphy's. "Wraith," I shouted, "I propose an alliance between yours and mine until we get out of here alive." Laura stared at me with her empty silver eyes for a second. Then she blinked them once, and they turned darkening by a few degrees. They went out of focus for a moment, and she tilted her head. Lord Wraith abruptly stepped forward, appearing from behind his daughters. "Naturally, Dresden," he said in a smooth tone. Unless you knew what you were looking for, you'd never have seen the glassy shine in his eyes, or heard the slightly stilted cadence of his words. He put on a good act. But I had to wonder just how much of his mind Laura had left him. Though I regarded myself as bound by honor to see your protection in the face of this treachery, I can only be humbled by the nobility of you offering me your yeah, whatever, all right, I snapped, glaring past him at Laura. "Run away now. Speeches later." Laura nodded and looked quickly around her. Maybe 20 of the Wraith clan had survived the fight. The remaining ghouls had sprung away during our unexpected assault, and now prowled in circles around us, well out of arm's reach, but close enough to rush back if they saw a weakness. They were waiting for the others to finish off the last of the Skavis and Malvora. Once they got here, they'd overrun us, easily. Near the gate, Marcone's soldiers had a steady line of white-robed thralls moving out of the cavern. There were rather more of them still alive than I had supposed there would be, until I saw that the circling ghouls were largely ignoring the passive thralls, focused instead on what they knew to be the real threat, the keepers of the mind-numbed herds. "Dresden!" Marcone shouted. His shotgun boomed once more and then clicked empty. I heard him feeding new shells, and the Murphy's gun chattered. "They're coming." I grunted acknowledgement and said to Laura, "Bring the thralls." "What?" "Bring the bloody thralls," I snarled, "or you can damned well stay here." Laura gave me a look that might have made me a little nervous about getting killed if I weren't such a stalwart guy. But then Lord Wraith snapped to the vamps around him. "Bring them!" I turned, drawing more hellfire into the staff, and knew that I wasn't going to be able to manage much more in the way of magic. I had just done too much, and it was on the last legs. I had to pull off one more spell if any of us were going to make it out. Murphy's gun kept rattling away, as did Hendrix's, and I could hear gunfire coming from the soldiers around the gate now as well, as the ghouls on the opposite side of the cavern began to turn from the ruined remains of the leaders of House Scaevus and Malvora. "Go," I said. "Go, go, go." We headed for my gate. The vampires seized thralls as they went, tossing them into the center of the group, forming a ring around them. Wraith formed the core of the group, with his daughters and their swords around him, and the thralls forming a thick human shield around them in turn. Trust Laura to turn what she had seen as a hindrance to her advantage. It was the way her mind worked. We started out at a quick pace, and then an almost human voice cried out. There was a surge of magic that flashed against my wizard senses, and the lights went out. The cavern's lighting had been of excellent quality. It had remained functional all through the duel, despite the magic Ramirez and I had been hurling around, and through the opening of not one, but 2 gates to the Never Never. That implied that Wraith had invested in lightning with a long track record of high performance and reliability to continue functioning through so much. But there's never been an electrical system a wizard couldn't put down with a little direct effort, and this one was no exception. Even as I lifted my staff to call up more light, my brain was padding through the logic stream. Verto had seen us making a break for it, or Cowell had, though again. I had to remind myself that Cowell's presence was still theoretical. However well supported by circumstantial evidence the theory might be. Killing the lights wasn't going to be a hindrance to the vampires or to the ghouls, which meant that he was trying to hamper us people. Sinking the cavern into stringent blackness would make Marcone's troops almost impotent. Hamper or slow any of the escaping thralls, therefore slowing the vampires, apparently intent upon protecting them. My staff hadn't been made to produce light, but it was a flexible tool, and I'd sent more hellfire through it as I lifted it overhead to light our way, sending out red-orange light in the shape of the runes and sigils carved into the staff out over the darkness. And just as I did, I realized what else the darkness would do. It would force the humans to produce light. Specifically, it would draw the response from wizards that being sunk into darkness always did. We called light, by one method or another. It was the first thing any wizard would do in a situation like this one. We'd do it fast, too. Faster than anyone without magic could pull out a light of his own. So as my staff lit up, I realized that I had just declared my exact position to every freaking monster in the whole freaking cavern. The darkness had been a trap designed to elicit this very response, and I walked right into it. Ghouls let out howls of fury and surged toward me through 100 rune-shaped scarlet spotlights that glinted on their blooded fangs, their talons, those horrible, hungry, sunken eyes. Guns roared all around me, splattering the nearest ghouls into black, blooded slurry. It wasn't enough. The creatures simply surged forward, being torn apart until Murphy's gun clicked empty. Reloading. she screamed, ejecting the weapon's magazine, holding a step back as the ghoul she'd only wounded continued toward me. Marcone's gun roared, and that ghoul went away. But when he pumped the weapon, it clicked on an empty chamber. He dropped it for the little submachine gun clipped to his harness, and for a second or two it cut through ghouls like a scythe ripping in a great horizontal swath. And then it too ran empty. I stepped forward as another wave of ghouls bounded over those the gunfire had held off. Murphy and Marcone had bought me time enough for the spell I had been forming in my mind to meet my will and congeal into fire. I whirled the staff overhead and then brought it down, gripped in both hands, striking its end on the stone floor as I cried, "Flammamoris!" There was a crackling howl, and fire ripped its way up out of the stones of the floor. It rippled out from the point of impact in a line running 30 or 40 yards in either direction, a sudden fountain of molten stone that shot up in an ongoing curtain 10 or 12 feet high, angled toward the ghouls charging us from the far side of the cavern. Blazing liquid stone fell upon them, among them, and the oncoming tide of screaming ghouls broke upon the wall of stone and fire with screams of agony, and for the first time, of fear. The wall held off fully half the ghouls in the cavern and screened us from Vito's sight. It also provided all the humans with plenty of light to see by. "Hell's bells, I'm good," I wheezed. The effort of the spell was monumental. Even with the hellfire to help me, I'd staggered, the light vanishing from the runes of my staff. "Harry, left!" Murphy screamed. I turned my head to my left in time to see a ghoul, half its body a charred ruin, slam Hendricks aside as if the huge man had been a rag doll and throw itself at me, while two more leaped over the group from behind and tried to follow in its wake. I was pretty sure I could have taken the ghoul, provided he wasn't much heavier than a loaf of bread, and had no idea how to use those claws and fangs. But just in case he was heavier than he looked, and competent at ripping things apart, I flung up my shield bracelet. It sputtered into life for a second, and the ghoul bounced off it, and the effort it cost me nearly made me black out. I fell. The ghoul recovered and thrashed toward me, even as I saw Thomas appear from the ranks of vampires and thralls and attack its two companions from behind. My brother's pale face was all but glowing. His eyes were wide with fear, and I hadn't ever seen him move that fast. He hamstrung both of the other ghouls with the blades in his hands. Well, if hacking through 3/4 of a leg included that thick, black thigh bones could be considered hamstringing. He left them on the ground while other wraiths tore them to pieces. Thomas leapt at the lead ghoul. He wasn't fast enough. The ghoul came at me with a dreadful howl. I didn't have enough energy left to lift my body up off the floor and face my killer head on. Fortunately, I did have enough energy to draw the .44 from my duster pocket. I'd like to tell you that I waited to the last second for the perfect shot, coolly facing down the ghoul with nerves of steel. The truth is that my nerves were pretty much shot, and I was too tired to panic. I barely got the sights lined up before the ghoul's jaws opened wide enough to engulf my entire head. I never consciously pulled the trigger, but the gun roared, and the ghoul's head snapped back before it crashed into me. There was pain, and I suddenly couldn't breathe. "Harry?" Thomas cried. The weight vanished from my chest, and I sucked in a breath. I got my left hand free and pounded at the ghoul with the .44. "Easy!" Murphy shouted. "Easy, Harry!" Her small, strong fingers caught my wrist and eased the gun out of it. I dimly realized that I was lucky it hadn't gone off again while I was thrashing around with it. Thomas flung the ghoul off me, and it landed in a heap. The back upper quarter of its head was gone. Just gone. "Nice shot," Marcone noted. I looked back to see him lifting a pale and sweating Hendricks, getting one of the big man's arm under his shoulder and supporting his weight. "Shall we?" Thomas hauled me to my feet. "Come on. No time to rest now." "Right," I said. I raised my voice and called, "Laura, get them moving." We started toward the gate, keeping the curtain of molten fire on our flank. It was hard just moving one foot in front of the other. It took me a while to notice that Justine was under one shoulder, supporting part of my weight, and that I was walking amidst the thralls near the White King and his guard. The vampires were still the outer guard, spread out over a half circle, in what amounted to a running battle. Only we weren't running, it was more of a steady walk, made all the more eerie by hellish light and shadow and desperation. Murphy's gun chattered several more times and then fell silent. I heard the throaty bellow of my .44. I checked my hand, and sure enough, my gun wasn't there. "Leave them!" I heard Laura snap, her cold silver voice slithering around pleasantly in my ear. "Keep the pace steady. Stay together. Give them no opening." We walked, the vampires growing more desperate and less human as the fight went on. The ghouls roared and screamed and died. So did wraiths. The cold subterranean air of the cavern had grown greenhouse hot, and it felt as if there weren't enough air left in the air. I panted hard, but it never seemed to get enough into my lungs. I kept lifting one foot and putting it back down again, numbly noticing that Marcone was behind me with Hendricks, doing the same thing. I glanced to my left and saw the fiery fountain of molten stone beginning to dwindle. It hadn't been an ongoing spell I had to keep pumping power into. That's the beauty of earth magic. Momentum. Once you get it moving, it doesn't slow down very quickly. I'd pour fire magic into all that stone and forced it to expand out of the earth and around it. It had simply taken this long for the spell to play out. But that's exactly what had happened. The spell was beginning to play out, much as I had. The curtain lowered, slowly, thinning and growing less hot, and I could see ghouls behind it ready to attack. I noted idly that they would be able to rush right into our group of dazed thralls, wounded gangsters, and weary wizards with nothing much to oppose them. "Oh, God," Justine whimpered. She'd noticed, too. "Oh, God." The ghouls had all seen the curtain lowering. Now they rushed forward to the very edge of the fading curtain, seemingly uncaring of the molten stone on the floor, dozens of them. A solid line of creatures just waiting for the first chance to bounce over and eat our faces. A blast of green light flashed down the line. It went completely through two ghouls, leaving them howling on the floor, severed a third ghoul's arm at the shoulder, and continued on through the white throne, leaving a hole the size of a laundry basket in its back. Ramirez had been waiting for them to line up like that. He stood, his weight on one foot at the far end of the lowering wall of flaming stone, on the ghoul side, arms akimbo. They whirled toward him, but Ramirez started lifting his arms alternately from his hip to extend before him, the motion like that of a gunfighter in the Old West. And every draw flung more silent green shafts of deadly light through the ghouls. Those nearest him tried to rush forward for the kill, but Ramirez had their measure now, and he wasn't content to leave a single gaping hole, thrusting that it would incapacitate them sufficiently. He hurled blast after hideous, ruinous blast, and left nothing but a scattered pile of twitching parts of the first ghouls to rush him. And those beyond them suffered nearly as greatly. Flesh-spilled black ichor rushed back and forth across the cavern floor, and it looked like a deck of a ship pitching on a lunatic sea. "What are you waiting for, Dresden?" Ramirez shouted. "One little bit of Volcanomony, and you get worn out?" A particularly well-aimed bolt tore the heads from a pair of ghouls at once. "How do you like that?" We all began hurrying ahead. "Not bad," I slurred back at him, "for a virgin." His rate of fire had begun to slacken, but the gib drew a fresh burst of ferocity out of Ramirez, and he redoubled his efforts. The ghouls howled their frustration and bounded away from the wall of fire, out of its treacherous light, and away from the power of the warden of the White Council, ripping them to shreds. "It hurts," bellowed Ramirez drunkily, flinging a last pair of bolts at a fleeing ghoul. "Ow, ow, it hurts. It hurts to be this good." There was a hiss of sound, a flickering of steel, and one of Vito Malvora's knives hit Ramirez's stomach so hard that it threw the young man off his feet and to the ground. "Man down!" Marcone shouted. We were close enough to the gate that I could see the pale blue light that spilled through it. Marcone waved his hand through a couple of signals and flicked a finger at Ramirez, then at Hendricks. The armed men, mercenaries, they had to be. No gang of criminal thugs was so disciplined. Rushed forward, taking charge of the wounded, seizing Ramirez and dragging him back toward the gate, roughly pushing and shoving the thralls ahead and toward the gate. I went to Ramirez, staggering away from Justine. The knife had hit him in the guts, hard. Ramirez had worn a Kevlar vest, which wasn't much good for stopping sharp, pointy things, though it had at least kept the knife's hilt from tearing right through the muscle and soft tissue. I knew there were some big arteries there, and more or less where they were located, but I couldn't tell if the knife was at the right angle to have hit them. His face was terribly pale, and his eyes blinked woozily as his soldiers started dragging him across the floor, and his legs thrashed weakly, bringing his own left leg up into his field of view. "Bloody hell!" he gasped. "Harry, there's a knife in my leg. When did that happen?" "In the duel," I told him. "Don't you remember? I thought you'd stepped on me and sprained my ankle," Ramirez replied. Then he blinked again. "Bloody hell! There's a knife now in my guts!" He peered at them. "And they match!" "Be still," I warned him. Vampires and thralls and mercenaries were falling back through the gate now. "Don't move around, all right?" He began to say something, but a panicked vampire kicked his leg as he went past. Ramirez's face twisted in pain and then suddenly slackened, and his eyes fluttering closed. I saw his staff on the ground and grabbed it, and pitched it through the gate after him. The men carrying him as the fight began got me closer, while most of the retreating vampires still fought off the determined assaults of the ghouls. "How long?" I heard Marcone demand of one of the soldiers. The men checked his watch, an expensive Swiss stopwatch with springs and cogs, not some digital thing. 3 minutes, 11 seconds, the soldier said. "How many charges?" 6 doubles, he replied. "Hey," I snapped at Marcone. "Cutting it a little close, huh?" "Any longer and they wouldn't accomplish anything," Marcone replied. "Can you walk?" "Yes, I can walk," I snapped. "I could get someone to carry you," Marcone said, his tone salacious and serene. "Bite me," I growled and called. "Murphy?" "Here," Murphy called. She was among the last of those retreating from the ghoul onslaught. Her boxy little Volvo of a gun was hanging by its strap on one shoulder, and she held my .44 in both hands, though it looked almost comically overlarge for her. "Ramirez has got a knife in his stomach," I said. "I need you to look after him." "He's the other warden, right?" "Yeah," I said. "He's already through the gate." "What about you?" I shook my head and made sure my duster was still covering most of me. "Malvora is still out there. He might try to kill our gate, or try some other spell. I've got to be one of the last ones through." Murphy gave me a skeptical look. "You look about to fall over. You in any shape to do more magic?" "True," I said, and offered her my staff. "Hey, maybe you should do it." She gave me a hard look. "No one likes a wise ass, Harry." "Are you kidding? As long as the wise ass is talking to someone else, people love him." I gave her half a smile and said, "Get out of here." "How are we getting back out again?" she asked. "Thomas led us here, but he'll lead you back," I said. "Or one of the others will. Or Ramirez, if some idiot doesn't kill him trying to help him. If it's all the same to you, I'd rather you did it, Harry." She touched my hand and departed through the broad oval of the gate. I saw her hurry through ankle-deep snow between what looked like sheltering pine trees to Ramirez's side, where he lay limply on his cloak. The thralls looked confused, which of course they would be, and cold, which, given their wardrobe, of course they would be. "That's all of ours," shouted the soldier to Marcone. 2 minutes, 15 seconds. He had to shout. The nearest of the ghouls were about 10 feet away, doing battle against, for lack of a more cliched term, a thin white line of wraith, including my brother, with his 2 blades spinning. "Go," Marcone said, and the soldier went through. Marcone, a fresh shotgun in hand, stepped up next to me. "Dresden? What are you hanging around here for?" "If you recall," he said, "I agreed to extract you alive. I'm not leaving until I have done so." He paused and added, "Provided, of course, that it happens in the next 2 minutes." From where I was standing, I could see 3 2-brick bundles of C4, detonators thrust into their soft surfaces, each fitted with odd-fashioned precision timepieces. There were simple charges on the floor. The other 3 must have been shaped charges affixed to the cavern walls. I had no idea how much destruction was going to be wrought by them, but I didn't suppose it would be much fun to be there when they went boom. Alas, that the poor ghouls would most likely be staying for the fireworks. "Thomas," I called, "time to go." "Go?" Thomas shouted, and the other vampires with him broke from their line and fled for the gate, except for one, a tall, female wraith, who, I blinked. Holy crap! It was Laura! The other vampires fled past me through the gate, and Thomas and his sister stood alone against the horde of 8-foot ghouls, stood against it, and stopped it cold. Their skin gleamed colder and whiter than glacial ice. Their eyes blazed silvery bright, and they moved with blinding speed and utterly inhuman grace. His saber fluttered and slashed, drawing a constant stream of blood, punctuated by devastating blows of his kukri. Right. That was the name of the inward bent knife. I knew I'd remember it eventually. Laura moved with him, trailing her damp, midnight hair in shredded silk kimono. She covered Thomas's back like a cloak hung from his shoulders. She was no weaker than her younger brother, and perhaps even faster. And the wavy-bladed short sword in her hand had a penchant for leaving spills of ghoulish entrails in its wake. Together, the pair of them slipped aside from repeated rushes and dealt out deadly violence to one foe after another. Ultimately, I think their fight was futile, and all the more valiant and astonishing from being so doomed. No matter how lethal Thomas and Laura proved to be, or how many ghouls went screaming to the floor, their black blood continued to slither back into their fallen bodies, and the ghouls that had been taken down continued to gather themselves together to rise and fight again. Most of those who re-entered the fight with renewed vigor and increased fury remained hideously maimed in some way. Some thralled their entails like slimy gray ropes behind them. Others were missing sections of their skulls. At least 2 entered the fray armless, simply biting with their wide jaws of vicious teeth. Beside the beauty of the brother and sister vampires, the ghouls' deformed bodies and hideous energies were all the more monstrous, all the more vile. "My God," Marcone said, his voice hushed. "It is the most beautiful nightmare I have ever seen." He was right. It was hypnotic. "Time," I asked him, my voice rough. He consulted his own stopwatch. 1 minute, 48 seconds. "Thomas!" I bellowed. "Laura! Now!" With that, the pair of them bounded apart, apparently the last thing the ghouls had been expected, and dashed for the gate. I turned to go, and that was when I felt it. There was a dull pulse, a throb of some power that seemed at once alien and familiar, a sickening, whirling sensation, and then a sudden stab of energy. It wasn't a magical attack. An attack implies an act of force that might be predicted, countered, or at least mitigated in some way. This was something far more existential. It simply asserted itself, and by its very existence it dictated a new reality. A spike of thought slammed into my being like a physical blow. It wasn't any single thought. It was, instead, a melange of them. A cocktail of emotions so heavy, so dense that it drove me instantly to my knees. Despair flooding through me. I was so tired. I had struggled and fought to achieve nothing but raw chaos, rendering my whole of my effort useless. My only true friends had been badly injured, or had run, leaving me in the hellish cavern. Those who currently stood beside me were monsters, of one stripe or another. Even my brother, who had returned to his monstrous ways in feeding on other human beings. Terror followed hard on its heels. I had been paralyzed while surrounded by monsters of resilience beyond description. In mere seconds they would fall on me. I had fallen on my face toward the gate, and though physical movement was beyond me, I could see that everyone had also pitched over onto the ground, vulnerable to the attack while the gate remained open. Vampires, thralls, and mortal warriors alike, they had all fallen. Guilt came next. Murphy, Carlos. I had gotten them both killed. Useless. It had all been useless. Marcone's stopwatch lay on the ground near his limp, outstretched hand. He'd fallen next to me. The second hand was sweeping rapidly downward, and the watches on the charges of C4, the nearest of them about 10 feet away, did the same. Then I understood it. This was Vito Malvora's attack. This hideous, paralyzing brew of everything darkest in the moral soul was what he had poured out. As the Wraith administered desire, the Malvoras gave fear, and the Skavis despair. Vito had gone beyond them all. He had taken all the worst of the human soul and forged it into a poisonous, deadly weapon. And I hadn't been able to do a damned thing to stop him. I lay staring at Marcone's stopwatch and wondered which would kill us first, the ghouls or the explosion. Thank you for listening to Chapter 40. Stay tuned.